Time. I want to talk to you about time today. And in a series that we're doing here, the lesser known heroes of the Bible, when I think about time, I'm thinking about the timing that took place in a person's name. His name was Mordecai. And he was connected to somebody you probably know better named Esther, book in the Bible. We're going to talk about Mordecai today, though. He's just one of those lesser known guys, but the thing that he did, the way that he was positioned just right by God and the timing that he was able to use accomplished great things for the Jewish people at a very critical time in their history. When I think about the word time, though, I think of a couple words in the original language. One of the words is chronos, and it's translated as time, and it really means a span of time, just a long, maybe perhaps span of time, decades, might be century or something like that, but chronos is a span of time. And then there's this kairos time. Kairos is a particular moment in time, and it means that it had an impact, really made an impact. So when I think about the long span of time, and there's these moments in time that really add up to all the things that take place in the world, it's interesting to study time from those perspectives. You know, Winston Churchill was a great leader, a great statesman of England. We all know about him. There was a time where he had reached, at 33 years of age, probably the apex of his career, some thought. And then politics began to turn against him. Churchill was just kind of pushed aside, and he came to the forefront again around 1939, 1940. The Germans were attacking in Europe, and they were conquering, by 1940, they were conquering France. It set their sights on England, so they were coming after them next. And Churchill had been elected Prime Minister of England. They needed him then, and he stepped up. And he gave a great speech where he said, "We face a lot of danger right now. Perhaps no time in our empire have we ever seen anything like this. But," he says, "I believe that this will be our finest hour." Now, he had reduced the time of all the empire there through all those centuries, and he says, right now, at this moment, this may be our finest, and he said very specifically, our finest hour. That's a moment in time. And for England, as we know, the Battle of Britain, and they won that battle. England continued to get attacked by Germany throughout the war, but when everybody else, like the Americans, came in, then they were able to overthrow what the Germans were trying to do. But nobody will ever forget what Winston Churchill did for England, what he really did for the world. He was the right man for that right time in history. I believe God had a hand in that. I won't get into all the details why I believe that, but I do believe God had a hand in that. And I believe God has a hand in the affairs of mankind in general. And the big idea of the message today is this: God's timing in the circumstances of life is perfect. It's always perfect. He comes not too soon, not too late. I want us to look at, in the book of Esther today, I want us to look at this man, Mordecai. I think he was a man for a specific time, and we'll see that as it unfolds throughout the book of Esther. So when I began to study the book of Esther, one of the first things I see is there's these good times, bad times. You know, there's a great old rock and roll song by Led Zeppelin called Good Times, Bad Times, and I won't refer too much more to it than that. But they're just simply saying, even in that song, there's times when we're living, and you can have at the same time good times going on, and over here there's some bad times just right at the doorstep. Good times, bad times. And for this person named Esther, the good times were about to come. You know, and I think of how she might look at things, and Mordecai might look at things. It might be something like what Charles Dickens had to say at the beginning of one of his books. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the spring of hope, and it was the winter of despair. You ever feel like life is that way? It just kind of, this just pull and tug back and forth, you know, good times, bad times. What were the good times for Esther? Well, there were these people called the Persians, and they conquered the world. And they had a great king named Xerxes. And Xerxes was celebrating one time with a big banquet, and he was feeling pretty festive, pretty high, and he called for the queen to come. Queen Vashti was her name, and he wanted her to come and just to put on just her robe and hat and her crown. She was so elegant looking, and he wanted to kind of show her off. And she didn't want to do it. She didn't feel like being the object of everybody's eyes that night. So she refused to come, and the advisors of the king said, this isn't good, king, because other women in the empire are going to look at that and say, we can just, anytime we want to, say no to any man, or especially our husbands, we can say no at any time. The king says, you're right, what are we going to do? We said, well, we can't have her being queen anymore. So she was just kind of pushed aside. The good times for Esther are about to arrive, because the king says, I got to have a queen. Let's send out throughout the whole empire, see if we can find out where there's some women that can come, and I'll just take a look at them, and I'll find one of them. She will be the new queen. And so from all over these provinces, they send in these women, beautiful women. Esther was one of them. A little Jewish gal, just a young lady, and nobody knew she was Jewish. But she comes before the king just like all the other ladies do, and the king sees her, he says, that's the one right there. I want her. Boy, she's thinking, good times now. I get to be the queen. But Mordecai was right there with her. And he had something to say to her. If you go over to the book of Esther, that was very important. Esther chapter 2, verse number 10, it says that Esther had not told anyone of her nationality and family background because Mordecai had directed her not to do so. The time was not ready for her to reveal that she was Jewish. So she becomes the queen, and then you go on down to verse number 20 of that same second chapter, and it says, Esther continued to keep her family background and nationality a secret. She was still following Mordecai's directions, just as she did when she lived in his home. They were related. They were cousins. Her parents died. He took her in, and he really tried to school her on everything she needed to know about the Jewish faith and everything she would need to know about living life. And she learned well. She was an elegant woman, very intelligent woman. But she was always listening to Mordecai, who had a great sense of timing. Don't tell the king or anyone else that you're Jewish. So she didn't. Mordecai was loyal to the king. On one occasion, he overheard a couple of men who were plotting an assassination against the king. And Mordecai tipped it off to a couple of guys who told the king, and they investigated. They found out that two guys were trying to assassinate the king. Well, they were executed in place of the king being assassinated. And that was just kind of something that Mordecai did to help save the king. He was loyal to the king, but nobody really even thought much about that. Good times. Mordecai, not living a bad life. Esther's living a great life. Jewish people doing all right. But then the bad times come. Enter a man named Haman, powerful, influential man. He hated the Jews. He especially hated Mordecai because when Haman walked by, and he was supposed to be the most noblest of all the nobles, and as he walked by, he expected people just to kind of bow their heads at him, to show respect for him, and Mordecai refused to do it. This is just a man. I don't think Mordecai trusted him. We'll find out reasons here in a minute why he didn't trust him, but he just looked at Haman and said, I don't think that man deserves the respect that he thinks he does. Well, this just really got to Haman. He just says, Mordecai's going to have to pay for this. Nobody disrespects me like that. So, in Esther chapter 3, verses 8 through 11, this man, Haman, had risen to the top of all the nobles, all the advisors to the king. And he comes to the king in verse number 8 of chapter 3 and says, Haman approached King Xerxes and said, there is a certain race of people scattered through all the provinces of your empire who keep themselves separate from everyone else. Their laws are different from those of any other people, and they refuse to obey the laws of the king. So it is not the king's interest to let them live. If it please the king, issue a decree that they be destroyed, and I will give 10,000 large sacks of silver to the government administrators to be deposited in the royal treasury. I'll pay for this, Let's just send out the decree that all these people, these Jewish people, that's who he's talking about, all of them are to be annihilated. Xerxes listened to that and says, well, I don't want anybody to be a threat to my... They're not obeying the laws? No. Well, I can't have that. They're not being good citizens at all, are they? Oh, Haman says, no. He says, these people need to be done away with. Okay, take care of what you got to take care of. So Haman hatches a plan, and the word is going out throughout the provinces that they're going to kill all the Jewish people. But good times, bad times, God's time. God's time is interesting because he knows that timing is everything. God always does. Timing is everything. Mordecai knew the timing was right to approach Queen Esther in behalf of the people. He knew there was a time that he had to challenge her, that she's going to have to step up as queen. She's going to have to do something to save her people. So he approaches the queen, and he explains the whole thing. He says, you have the power to approach the king. She says, I can't approach the king unless he calls me in. If he's sitting on his throne, nobody approaches him unannounced. He has to call them in. If they walk in, the only hope you got at that point is he extends the golden scepter to you. Then you can approach him. But there's no guarantee. Most folks, if they walk in unannounced like that, they pay for that with their lives. The king runs a pretty tight court. He said, well, I think you're just going to have to risk it because there's a lot at stake. Your people, the Jewish people, all of them may die. And so in chapter 4, verses 13 and 14, Mordecai sent this letter to Esther. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all the other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, notice that the word time, at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for such a time as this? And that's that kairos time, for this moment in history. Who knows that this is what God has prepared your life for? You're not just the queen just because you're good looking and the king liked you. God placed you in this position. Who knows, but for such a time as this. In the book of Ephesians, the Apostle Paul had these words to say, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 15. Be careful how you live. Don't live like fools, but like those who are wise. Make the most of every opportunity in these evil days. Now, make the most of every opportunity. That's the translation here, the New Living Translation. The New American Standard, I think, has it most accurate, though. It says, make the most of your time. And the word is kairos. Make the most of those moments that God puts right in your life to make a difference, perhaps in somebody else's life. You know, I like what Christine Meredith, who is now a missionary that we support in the Dominican Republic, she's a good school teacher, taught school for a number of years, but she had this passion after she had gone down to Haiti and Dominican Republic. She had this passion to want to go there and really work with the people all the time. So a couple years ago, she just said, what's it take to go? And she began that journey to put all the things together. And in January of this year, she went to the Dominican Republic. We talked back and forth a little bit. We were able to text back and forth a little bit. And she's just excited about what God is doing, using her to touch people's lives in the DR. Why did she do that? She kept praying, God, what would you have me do? What would you have me do? There's something developing here. And God says, I think I want you to go to the Dominican Republic. At first, it was Haiti. And then the plan changed because of conditions in Haiti and to the Dominican Republic. And this is the time you go. There were several times that we thought it was maybe ready for her to go, and it wasn't. And it finally came out in January. This is the time, that kairos moment. And she was looking for that moment all along, being willing to be able to prepare for that. And she did. She prayed and prayed about this, and then God says, this is the time you move. Now, for Esther, She just didn't say, okay, I'll go before the king. She goes into a time of prayer too. She encourages those who were her handmaidens around her and various people she trusted. Please, please be in prayer about all this. She was, in this preparation of prayer time, she was really putting it before God for him to direct all the issues that mattered in his timing. So when she prepared, then it became a time to act, a time to act. On that Mordecai's prompting, through the prayers that were offered between him, her, and all the people around her, she came to this conclusion: I will go see the king. If I must die, I must die. She knew that was a real risk. But this was the moment. This was the kairos moment, the time that she needed to go. So in Esther chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, it says, on the third day of the fast, fasting and praying, Esther put on her royal robes and entered the inner court of the palace just across from the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, he welcomed her and held out the gold scepter to her. So Esther approached and touched the end of the scepter. She gained access to the king. She risked her life to do it. You said, well, now wait a minute. She was the wife of the king. I mean, she's got special favor, doesn't she? Well, the king didn't take a very good view of Vashti, did he, in chapter 1? This is a tough king, but he had a special place in his heart for Esther. And I think God's hand was moving through that whole time so that when she actually went in, king never thought a thing about it, just said, come forward, extended that scepter to her. Timing is everything. While this is going on, Haman's going on with his plan to annihilate all the Jews. He has a 70-foot pole with a big sharp edge on the point of it at the very top, 70 foot high, and he wanted to impale Mordecai on that in front of everybody. 70 foot high so everybody could see it. He wanted to have him up there on that. But the king, one night when he was in his palace trying to sleep, he could not sleep. Didn't know what was going on, but he got up and he began to read through some of the court records. And he heard about this Mordecai. He read about him. And he called his couple of advisors and he says, what's going on with this man here? This was a big deal. He saved my life, stopped these assassins. Was anything ever done for him? And they said, no, king, we just recorded what happened, but that's all. He said, well, something special ought to be done. I want our nobles to come and consider this. And he brings in the number one noble. You know who that is? That's Haman, this evil man. He said, Haman, you're going to love this. Haman, what would you do for a man who saved my life, exposed a plot that was against me, and he saved my life? What should be done for a man like that? And Haman says, oh, my goodness, king, you want to get your best horse out. You're going to want to put that guy in royal robes. You're going to want to sit him on that horse, and you're going to want your highest of nobles to lead him through the city so everybody could see him and honor him. He says, all right, Haman, that's a good plan. Let's put that plan in motion. I want to honor Mordecai. Set him on that horse, get him in royal robes, and you, Haman, lead him through the city. Can you imagine eating crow as bad as that? Haman had just be seething as he's leading that horse through the city, and all these people just praising Mordecai for what he had done. Flipped the tables on him really big, didn't he? And then there came a banquet when Esther stood before the king and said, I have a request to make. He said, well, you can have anything up to half of my kingdom, just say the word. She said, I'll let you know when that time comes. I'm going to have a banquet, and it's going to be you and me, and it's going to be Haman. And I'll let you know what I want. Okay? So they have this banquet. And in Esther chapter 7, verse number 3, it says, Queen Esther replied to the king when he says, what is it you really want? And she says, if I have found favor with the king, I think she had, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared. And then she spills out this plan that she knows Haman has. And the king is taken back by that. And he says, my goodness, Your people? You're standing up? I think he's thinking about her courage. He's also considering, I think, the timing of all this. By the way, Haman hears this because he's there at that little banquet, and he begins to sweat. He knows things are about to turn. It's not going to look good for him. The king is mad about this whole thing that he's been set up, and he leaves the room. He's walking around out in the courtyard, and here comes Haman over to Esther, and he falls at her feet. She's laying on this couch and he falls at her feet, and he starts begging, and he's pulling on her. About the time that the king walks back in and says, "What in the world are you doing? It's not enough that you set this bad plot in motion and everything. It's not enough that your destiny is evil here. You're even trying to accost my wife. Get this guy out of here." And they say, "Oh, well, the king," advisors step up and say, "King, listen, he has a 70-foot pole in his yard, and it's got a big point on it, and he wanted Mordecai to be thrown down onto that and impaled upon that." King says, "That works for him." And they impaled Haman from that pole. Haman's treachery was exposed, and he was introduced to his little torture device out in his yard. Well, it leads to this, though, that there's also a time to remember. To remember that God's timing is always perfect. You know, I failed to mention this, but I should mention it to you. Not once in the book of Esther, 10 chapters, is God's name ever mentioned. But God's providence and God's watchfulness over all things and his timing in all things just drips throughout the whole book of Esther. Jewish people connected to God, but not once is God's name mentioned. That's a curious thing. Commentators just kind of scratch their heads and say, "We don't get that one." But God's very much involved in this whole process. His timing is perfect, absolutely perfect. Look at Esther chapter 8, verse number 2. It says, "The king took off his signet ring, which he had taken back from Haman when he gave it to him when he said, 'You're going to be the big dog here for all of us.' And he gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai to be in charge of Haman's property." Well, Esther makes one more risk. She risks going before the king again, unannounced, where he'd have to extend that golden scepter. And she's asking, at this point, specifically asking for orders to reverse Haman's plan to annihilate all the Jews. So Xerxes issues a decree. Stop that plan. And it stopped. The Jewish people are saved because of Mordecai, who directed his cousin, his young cousin, to do the things that she ended up doing. He was the one behind it all. We always talk about Esther, but I think Mordecai is oftentimes the forgotten one in this whole story of how he directed everything. And he was very sensitive, I believe, to God's timing. So what do you do after all this is over? Well, I think you have to go through a time of remembering the time. We never should forget this. Our nation came that close to being reduced to nothing, annihilated, but for Mordecai and Esther. So in Esther chapter 9, verses 20 and 21, it says that Mordecai, who has risen in the estimation of the king, Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to the Jews near and far throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes, calling on them to celebrate an annual festival on these 2 days. And they still celebrate that festival every year. It's coming up very closely right now. Israel still celebrates this time with a feast. Whatever happened to Mordecai? Chapter 10 says this, verse number 3. Mordecai, the Jew, became the prime minister with authority next to the king, to that of the king Xerxes himself. He was very great among the Jews, who held him in high esteem because he continued to work for the good of his people and to speak up for the welfare of all their descendants. He never quit sensing God's timing to do the right things. So the conclusion of this is pretty simple. Our times are in his hands. That's what I learned from this story. When I think of Mordecai, I think he would agree with that. Our times, my time, your time, is in his hands. Now, we're not talking about that chronos time, but those individual moments where God's prompting you to say something, to do something that's good for somebody else, to meet the needs of somebody, maybe to just speak up for God. You got to pray about those things, but when they come, you'll know the time is right. It was King David over in Psalm 31, verse 15, who said these words, "My future is in your hands. Rescue me from those who hunt me down relentlessly." Again, New Living Translation, but I still like to go back to the New American Standard, and it literally says, "My times are in your hands. Rescue me." We live in a very interesting time. John Adams wrote to Thomas Jefferson one time, at the end of their lives, they died same day, just hours apart, these great patriots of our country. And it was John Adams who said to Thomas Jefferson, "We have lived in serious times, my friend. We live in serious times now." Where is God's influence being felt? Is God speaking to you and saying, this is a kairos moment for you to do something, just something here? I don't know if God's asking you to run for Congress or anything like that. It may not be a bad idea with consider what we got up there. But at the same time, I think God can use us in individual ways around our community, just to speak up for him. Do some kindness, an act of kindness. Looking for those moments, those times where he says, this is the kairos time for you. There'll be many of them if you're sensitive to it, and you'll find that you're being used by God, and there's not a greater feeling in the world than to know the God of the universe is using you at a particular moment in time. My times, your times, are in his hands. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for this opportunity to look into the scriptures again, and we see one of these lesser-known heroes of the faith, this man named Mordecai, a man who was very sensitive to your leading in his life, sensitive to how you would use him to work with his young cousin so that she could be used in a powerful way. How powerful is it to save an entire nation? And she did, because the timing was right. So, Father, the importance of timing in our lives is something we need to consider seriously. And that in those moments where we feel your prompting, where you're nudging us to stand up or to say something, help us to respond in a positive way. But we know we have to prepare for those times. We have to ask you to give us wisdom so that the timing is exactly right, because your timing is always perfect. Our times are in your hands, Father. Use us then for the betterment of your kingdom and to help reach a lost world for you. I pray these things in Christ's name. Amen. Well, as we come